Well, hello there. This is Dr. Dell, and I have a message for all of our coaches, and it's on the topics of motivation and learning techniques. Well, first of all, let's talk about motivation. This is very, very important for your students. And there's two types of motivation, intrinsic and extrinsic. Now, intrinsic motivation is when a student studies and learns math simply for the internal satisfaction and enjoyment that he or she gets out of it. In fact, this is what motivates virtually any person to play a game or a sport. It's this intrinsic motivation. Now, once a student starts to learn math and gain self-confidence and self-esteem, then usually intrinsic motivation sets in, because frequently it's not there when you first start, particularly if a student has had a bad experience with math. So this is what we want as both a coach and as a teacher. But as I said, for many students this takes some time, particularly in the beginning. So if that's the case, then a coach needs to use what we call extrinsic motivators. Now, an extrinsic motivation is when a student wants something that the study of math will provide for the student. And that something is what we call the extrinsic motivator. Now, there are many examples of this. For example, if a student wants to study some STEM subject, engineering, science, then that's going to be an extrinsic motivator because math is very necessary for virtually any STEM subject. So they're motivated to learn math because they want to study the science or engineering. Or suppose that a student wants to enter some technical field in industry or in the military. Then in this case, practical mathematics is certainly necessary, and that will serve then as an extrinsic motivator. Now, as you probably know, triad maths tiers 1 and 2 provide this necessary practical math for industry and the military, and it's also a great foundation for future math studies. And as you no doubt know, the standard math curriculum that is taught today in most schools is not necessary for these latter goals, and so therefore they don't serve as an extrinsic motivator for that. Now, if a student wants to excel on the SAT, then Tier 3 of the Triad Math program satisfies that need. Once again, it's quite different and much easier than the standard math curriculum. Now, there are many other extrinsic motivators that you can use to motivate a student to try to study math. For example, grades are sometimes used as an extrinsic motivator, or praise, or special privileges, or even money. Or there's a lot of things you can use. In fact, it may be that you want to just have the student avoid some kind of punishment. Now, we find that usually when the proper content and the proper pedagogy are utilized by the teacher, then usually the student becomes intrinsically motivated, since most of us enjoy anything that is challenging and that we succeed at. So let's assume that your student is motivated enough to study math, either extrinsically or intrinsically. It's imperative that the math be taught in such a way that the student is successful, because only that's going to lead to the intrinsic motivation and really lead the student to ultimate success. So what we have to do as a coach is be aware of the learning techniques that a student needs to employ. To successfully learn math, a coach needs to teach the student to engage in certain practices. Now, that's different than teaching the math itself. That's why the coach and the teacher are really two different necessary components of a good math learning experience. I'm going to recommend to you Dr. Barbara Oakley's great book entitled A Mind for Numbers, How to Excel at Math and Science Even If You Flunked Algebra, for an elaboration on the things that I'm going to recommend to you as a coach and, of course, then to any student. Now, there's a theory behind these recommendations which should help you understand these recommendations. And in fact, that theory is very well explained and described in Barbara Oakley's great book, A Mind for Numbers, How to Excel at Math and Science Even If You Flunked Algebra. But of course, the real proof is going to be your student's success. Now, here are your responsibilities as a coach, and I'm going to elaborate on these in this video. Now, number one, be sure that your student is studying math topics in a sequence so that he or she has already learned the necessary prerequisite topics for the topic at hand. 2, apply both focused and diffuse learning modalities. We'll have a lot to say about that. 3, establish appropriate habits to avoid procrastination. 4, do not try to cram a lot of math in too quickly. 5, be sure your student has a very good teacher teaching the appropriate math topics, content-wise, and also with the appropriate pedagogy, which is teaching techniques. And then 6, provide appropriate extrinsic motivators until the intrinsic motivators kick in. So now let's elaborate on number 1. Be sure your student is studying math topics in a sequence so that he or she has already learned the necessary prerequisite topics for the topic at hand. Learning math is sort of like climbing a ladder. If you proceed one step at a time, it is easy. But if you skip some steps for any reason, then it can be quite difficult or even impossible. As you know, each topic in math is going to depend on some previous topics and be easy to understand for the properly prepared student, but difficult or impossible otherwise. And that, of course, is why math needs to be taught in a self-paced manner, because there's many reasons that a student may need more time on a specific topic, or maybe the students miss some time, and you don't want them to skip any topic. So this definitely has to be done in a sequenced and a self-paced manner. It's also very important that a student be able to go back and review any previous topic, because you forget things very easily and often. In fact, review is an extremely important part of the educational process. Indeed, a student should spend much of his or her time simply reviewing and practicing previous materials exercises. This is what's necessary for retention and mastery of a topic. Practice is what makes perfect, like in any game or sport. And of course, a coach's responsibility is to be sure that this is what is happening with your student. And now comes a very, very important thing that many people don't understand, and that is you need to apply both what are called focused and diffuse learning modalities when learning math. Focused learning is having your student focus on a lesson for up to, say, 30 minutes with no distractions. This is when the student is, I'll say, rationally and consciously thinking about the topic of the lesson by watching the video or listening to the teacher explain what's happening, and then working on relevant exercises, and then taking a quiz whenever the student thinks that he or she understands the topic. In fact, you're going back and forth between communicating with the teacher to understand the topic and trying the exercises until you fully understand them. And when you do this, this is the conscious mind that is working. The important thing is that this is a conscious process of thinking about the topic. Trying various things and making mistakes is very common here. And in fact, the reward for this focused effort should not necessarily be the product of what comes out of the session, but rather the fact that the student has actually spent the time in a focused mode working on it. That's what really the achievement is. Sometimes the understanding is going to come quickly, sometimes it's going to come slowly. And sometimes the session is going to end in frustration with not understanding the topic at all. In fact, that's very common. It happens to us all the time. And that's why we need to practice what is called diffuse learning, which is something that many students don't understand until they experience it. In fact, a lot of coaches don't understand it, and that's what I want you to fully understand as a coach. Now, diffuse learning is what Dr. Oakley explains so well in her book. And this is what happens and occurs when you have the student then, after a focused session, do something else that's completely unrelated. In fact, something that requires little conscious thinking is really quite good. Go wash the dishes, cook, mow the lawn, take a walk, drive, play, anything. The subconscious mind is now going to think about the topic that you've been focusing on. Subconsciously. It's out of the conscious now. And this will be particularly true if the student is relaxed and not stressed. This mode of learning the topic, when you're not consciously thinking about it, is called diffuse learning mode. Now, as a matter of fact, it can seem almost magical. We don't really fully understand how this works, although there's quite a bit of theory behind it now that Dr. Oakley discussed. But the truth is, you just have to experience it to really fully believe it. When you finally then return to the topic later in a focused mode, usually now it's clarified and it seems much easier to understand. In fact, sometimes a solution to a problem will just pop into one's mind when it's least expected. As I said, Dr. Oakley explains this diffuse learning mode in depth in her book that I've already recommended to you. And I can testify this is how I learn new topics in any subject. And many experts agree with this too. In fact, I was just talking to my daughter about it. She is a professor of computer science at Indiana University, and she said absolutely this happens to her all the time. She'll focus on something and think about it and not come up with an understanding, and then she will go off and do other things, and suddenly then it'll become clear to her later on. Now, a coach needs to understand this and encourage a student to practice both the focused and the diffuse learning. And I would say this, for mathematics, particularly at this high school level, 2 or 3 such focus sessions a day should be a maximum you would do. In fact, 1 per day is quite okay if you're not in a particular hurry to learn the subject. Now, it's very important that you as a coach help your student establish appropriate habits, particularly to avoid procrastination, which of course is very easy for all of us to do. In fact, it's often best to get your student into a habit of studying math in the way we've just described, especially in the beginning with a student who doesn't like math or is afraid of it, where you're having to use the extrinsic motivators. Even experts find that the focused and the diffuse modes that we've just discussed earlier are very effective. In fact, often the longer you focus on something, the more confused you can become, and that's why you want to keep those sessions fairly short. Very often it's in the diffuse mode where the mind really is sorting things out. Now, how this all works is sort of a mystery. It has been to me always, and in fact, Dr. Oakley explains in her book quite a bit how the brain works and how this works. In fact, this is about as well as I've seen it explained by anyone. And it accounts for these aha moments and the inspiration and the revelations. They usually don't come until after you've had a long series of focused moments. Now, so far as the habit goes, I'll remind you that a habit is a result really of 3 things. First of all, there's a cue which causes you to engage in the habit. Then there's the action or the routine that is actually what you do when the habit. In this case, we're talking about doing a focused training session. And then after that, there's some kind of a reward. And that can be anything you want it to be. And again, that gets into motivation. And finally, there's a belief that you have that this habit is really going to work for you and give you the results that you want. So what you want to try to do is get your student to engage in a focused study session, usually no more than 30 minutes. That's the action or the routine. And you want to do that at least once a day as a result of some cue. Now, the cue can be like a time of day. It can be a special event. It can be anything you can think of. There's all sorts of things for cues. And then you want to find what we'll call a reward for your student after they've engaged in this focused study session, which was a result of this habit. Now, this reward, again, can be a lot of different things. It could be a material reward. It could be a privilege. Maybe it's just praise and recognition of success. Often that's the most effective thing you can do. Now, I want to emphasize to you that success means you've engaged in the focused lesson. It is not necessarily the result or the product of that lesson, because in fact, you may spend 30 minutes and come away confused and frustrated because you haven't figured out whatever it is you're trying to understand. You don't understand it yet. But the success is that you've engaged in the focus section, and now you're going to let your subconscious take over and see if it can do the job for you. Like I said, you may have nothing but frustration from the focus session, but the fact that you did it is what you're going to get rewarded for. And then, of course, you're going to need the diffuse learning time that we talked about already. Now, once a student gets practiced at doing the things we're talking about here, they should begin to experience what is called flow when they're in a focus session. Now, flow is what happens when you sort of forget yourself and other things around you and are just concentrated on the task at hand, which in this case is studying and thinking about the topic. In a sport, we call this being in the zone. Now, flow is a very enjoyable condition to be in. It leads to intrinsic motivation. And ultimately, the student's going to believe in the habit and find it easier to engage in when they know that they're going to get into a condition of flow. Now, once again, I refer you to Dr. Oakley for an elaboration on the psychology behind this. But I can just tell you that this is what I discovered somehow on my own many decades ago. In fact, it's why I was able to get a PhD in math. after I'd had great struggle in high school where I did not do well in algebra. In fact, I disliked it very much. But then it turned out I finally had a good teacher and a coach who taught me the things I'm telling you now. And then I really caught on. In fact, I believe that any student can learn math, certainly at the practical level, if it's properly taught and coached. And as a matter of fact, if you need help as a teacher, I can help you. As you know, we have products to do that. But only a coach can do the things we're talking about, one-on-one and in person. And of course, that is your role. That's why I'm talking to you as a coach. Now, principle number 4 is do not let your student try to cram a lot of math in too quickly. Successful learning requires the appropriate amount of time to do the things we've been talking about. If you try to cram for a math exam by waiting till the last minute to study the math, it's not going to work. It's kind of like waiting to practice for a race the night before the race. That just isn't going to work. In fact, it had a lot of negative consequences. Cramming is really a horrible thing. And as a coach, you should know this, and of course, and discourage any cramming. Do not reward it in any way. Now, you want to be sure that your student has a very good teacher teaching the appropriate math topics with the appropriate pedagogy. Pedagogy means the teaching techniques. Now, as far as topics go, I refer you to the syllabi for the 6 tiers in Triad Math programs to see what one set of contents that really works for virtually all students. As a matter of fact, this is a very complicated subject, and so for elaboration, you might want to read my 2011 book, Teaching Math, where I explain all of this, and I'm going to tell you why in that book our current standard math curriculum is failing our children in a very big way, and at all levels. Not only our weak students, but our good students are being hurt as well. And in fact, you can download a free PDF copy of this book at triadmathinc.com. Now, as I said, pedagogy, the way you teach, is extremely important also. The teacher's got to do it right. Learning for any student has got to be self-paced. So that way they're not going to skip topics and they're going to be able to go at a pace that's comfortable for them. And it needs to be interactive. That's why you need a lot of exercises and quizzes, constant feedback, and the ability to have the teacher explain things over and over. That's where videos are so valuable, because a student can pause them and back up and rewatch them and so on. And as I said, you've got to have the appropriate exercises and so forth to do this. So pedagogy is extremely important. Now, as a matter of fact, if you for some reason can't find a really good teacher for your student, then I suggest that you try Triad Math program and let me be your student's teacher and you be the coach. As you're going to learn on our website, it's going to cost you and your students very little to try it out, virtually nothing to try it and see if it works. And then it's going to be very cost effective for you if it does work. Probably more cost effective than anything else you can do. So you have very little to lose and much to gain. Okay, now number 6 for the coach is to find the extrinsic motivators that are going to work for your student until the intrinsic motivators kick in, and that's ultimately the teacher's job. It's the way math is taught and the topics that are taught. And of course, only the coach can really decide on these extrinsic motivators. Every student is different, and it's going to require different carrots and sticks, as I call them, for the students. So that's your job as a coach. I really can't help you with that at all, because it's a very individualized thing. Now, if the teacher does his or her job, then the student should eventually be enjoying learning math, and the intrinsic motivators should kick in, and then that's all it's going to take to keep the student going. Most students enjoy a subject once they begin to succeed in it, and then they get satisfaction from it and from their progress. In fact, they begin to find it, I'll put in quotes, fun. Like any game or sport, it's enjoyable. They get into a flow condition. Now, it takes some time at the beginning for some students to get started in this. That's especially true if they've had a bad experience in math. They're afraid of it. They don't like math. And that's very common, by the way, today. I find that all the time in adults. And it's amazing how they get transformed. In fact, the calculator training is one of the best ways to get them started, because it's kinesthetic in nature, and it's something everybody can do, and it's a lot of fun, and that usually gets them turned around psychologically. I will just tell you that when I was in high school, in Greencastle High School in Indiana, I hated algebra after 2 years of it at the high school level. And I wasn't going to go on studying math. I liked geometry, but I didn't like algebra. Well, I was very fortunate. I went to DePaul University when I was a senior as a special student, and I had a really good teacher, Dr. Clint Gass. And he was teaching me college algebra, and he taught it properly, and he taught me the things that I've been telling you about in this training. And I got to liking it, and I was really good at it. And in fact, I liked it so much, I ultimately went on and finally I got a PhD in modern algebra at Indiana University. And I can tell you it takes a lot of intrinsic motivation to do this. But it was a lot of fun. And by the way, I practiced all the things I'm telling you about in terms of both focused and diffuse learning. In fact, it always kind of amazed my fellow students. I would play rugby and ride motorcycles and do a lot of talking to people when I was in the diffuse mode. And that's what made the whole thing so successful from the focus mode. And a lot of students don't really fully understand that, but you need to as a coach. So this can actually be the experience of any student. Now, I don't mean that you're going to get a PhD in math, but in learning math, any student can learn the math that he or she needs for other subjects that he or she is going to be interested in. Now, as a matter of fact, it should all start with what I call practical math. And I've found that virtually any student can learn all of the algebra and geometry and trigonometry, including how to do all their arithmetic calculations with a scientific calculator, in less than a year, much less than a year usually. And then they'll be ready for a career in industry or the military or a non-professional technical career. This is really kind of what I learned in the very beginning, and it was great. When I worked on the railroad, I did various jobs, and it really helped me. Now, that's the first two tiers of our program. In Tier 3, then a student can get prepared for the SAT exam. There's not too much more math necessary, and you don't want to teach too much more math just to get ready for that exam. It's really just a little tricky exam. I talk a lot more about it other places. Now, for those students that think they might be interested in pursuing a STEM subject and study STEM subjects, science and engineering, then you can continue on in our program and learn all the math they're ever going to need in our Tiers 4, 5, and 6. Much deeper treatment of algebra, geometry, and trig in Tier 4. We'll call that pre-calculus. And Tier 5, we do calculus. In Tier 6, we do differential equations. By the way, that's never done in high school today. And calculus and differential equations today are incredibly easy to do thanks to a new modern 21st century tool, which I actually introduced back in Tier 4. That's a very complex subject, and a lot more videos on that elsewhere to learn about it. In fact, I urge you to study the various videos that we have on our websites and read the 4 books that we're going to give you in a PDF format to fully understand all of this. Your job as a coach is to be sure your students understand the potentialities that they can achieve, and then give them the appropriate guidance and encourage them to achieve them. And that means studying and teaching them how to study and form the habits we've talked about. Now, if it turns out that you select me as your student's teacher, then of course we're going to work closely together to ensure that your students are really successful. And I put this in plural. You may have one student, you have many students. Learning the appropriate math is just a great benefit to any student, and it's going to open up the doors of many opportunity. As a matter of fact, I believe that in this 21st century, matheracy, as I call it, may be almost as important as literacy, maybe in some cases more. In fact, math ought to be your second language usually, particularly if English is your first language. Now, fortunately, it's easy to achieve all this with the modern tools we've talked about. In fact, it's much easier to learn math today than it was even 50 years ago. And if you go to our website at triadmathinc.com, you're going to get a lot of additional information, many free videos there, lots of papers, lots of discussion of it to go beyond what this is. And so I'm going to wish you, of course, then the best wishes for your student success. And then I have 2 more things I want to tell you about. Now, you may have already watched the video and read this paper on teacher and coach, where I talk about how a student needs both a teacher and a coach to be successful at math. And if you haven't done so, I encourage you to watch that video and to read this paper as well. It goes along with what we just talked about. Also, we have a video and a paper for the students. It's called A Dozen Tips for Success, and this is something you want to give to your students to have them follow, because this will be the tool you will use as a coach to help guide your students as they practice all the things we've been talking about in this video. So this is Dr. Dell. I wish you great success and your students even greater success, and we'll see you on other videos.